the name of the other one. Anyway, it written up in both newspapers. Got my picture in both of them. Extension Service came out. Dr. Kottner and Dr. Dewars. And he looked around and he said, "Beck, this is beautiful. You sure you're not using any of our modern chemicals?" I said, "No, I'm being a purist. To make my living working on a railroad, this is my hobby. I want to see if I can do it all natural like our forefathers did." Anyway, with Sam Kottner, he said, "Well, this is okay for small acres, but not practical on large acres. We have to feed the world. We're here with a new challenge." You shouldn't have said that. I just got through building my wife a new home. We've been there 11 years, and I went in the house and told my wife, "We're going to sell this little farm and go buy a big farm." But she never argues. She said, "Okay, we're going to move. I want to go to Canal County. I want big pecan trees in the front yard. I want a big light oak tree. I want a deep well in the Edwards. I want a creek run through the place. I want a deer on the place." For fun, her and I would go around the good old farm. We found that farm. And we could buy it for a little less than we were offered for our new pretty place. So I moved on to it. Well, you talk about wore out. That place was wore out. It had been hated to death. Nothing would grow in those fields but bitter weeds and stickers, pioneer plants. So I had a sickle bar mowing machine on my tractor, and I just kept mowing weeds for 2 years. It'd come up, weeds would grow in poor soil. That's why nature put them here. Anyway, I mowed the weeds, and pretty soon I had weeds laying thick in those fields, but they wouldn't rot because there's no microbial activity or nitrogen. So I went to King Seed, and I told them I need some kind of legume to build up my soil with. And the guy talking to, old Bob Baker, he knew what I was talking about, so he sold me Hubam clover. I got scarified seed and the noctin to put on it, and I cycloned it out there, and I ran over it with my gang harrow. I had railroad ties following at the gang harrow, but I couldn't cut through all that mulch, but it did shake the seed through to the soil. Well, there came a few showers, and that stuff came up, and it didn't quit growing until it was 8 foot tall. Tallest clover anybody ever saw. Botany professor from Lady Lake University came out and documented it. Anyway, then this professor looked at me and he said, "Now Malcolm, this is the last time you can grow a clover crop this big." I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, truthfully, I don't know. I've never grown it. But that's what the old timers tell me." Well, I hired a guy to come combine that stuff, and when he looked at the heights of that clover, he said, "I ain't going in there. I'll just stay choked up all day." Well, I had to work with him all day and back up his flywheel. And we finally got it combined and advertised it on Callison Farm and Ranch Show. This is years ago. And that's the most money I ever made off that farm, selling that clover. So I said, "Man, I'm going back with clover," but that professor was correct. You can only make one clover crop. But I found out why. Well, in nature, on a wild seed head, on a wild plant, some of the seeds on the bottom of the cluster will be heavily coated with shellac or some kind of coating. The higher up the seed head you go, the less they're coated. And those that are not hardly coated at all, they will come up with a small shower and poor soil. But the further down that seed head you go, it's going to take a richer soil and more microbial activity. And right down at the bottom of those seeds where they're really thickly coated, it takes humic acids, carbonic acids, and a lot of microbial activity to eat through that coating so that germs can get moisture. Well, that happened. I planted clover next year. My clover came up, but so did plants and weeds and forbs and herbs that people hadn't seen in that country for years. They came up with the clover, and they crowded out the clover. I couldn't combine it. But let me tell you something. That soil turned from a rusty yellow to black. And from then on, we could really grow good vegetables. And I kept it that way. I've never planted the whole place in vegetables. I do 22 rows of vegetables, 22 rows of cover crop, 22 rows of vegetables, 22 rows of cover crop. And this worked out beautiful. My vegetables were mixed up in those 22 rows. I never planted a solid patch of anything other than corn because it needed to be together, and potatoes I had to dig down. Anyway, in my cover crop on each side was vetch and rye. Vetch is a legume. It blooms and has a deep taproot and it fixes its own nitrogen. And the rye is a grass, and it would get better than waist high, and they would grow together. Well, these were winter plants. Well, through the winter, this is where the green lacewing flies, the lady beetles, the big eye bugs, all the beneficials hibernate. And then on each side of the cover crop, or in between the cover crops, that's where I put my vegetables in the spring. Well, when these beneficial insects, it's time for them to mate and deposit eggs, they came out to my cash crop and deposited their eggs. So I had a beneficial insectary on both sides of my cash crop. And we had beautiful vegetables, 100% organically grown. And I took a load of these vegetables into Waite Small Market and found this guy. This guy was known all over the state for his best vegetables. And I told him I had some organically grown vegetables I wanted to show him. He said, "Fella, I've seen organic stuff. It's full of weevils, bug holes, and everything else." And I walked off. I went home and I told Dale, "That guy, we look at our stuff." She said, "I'll go in there."
Oh, no, Dale, you'll understand this part of your better.
Well, she cheated. She prettied herself up a little bit. She found Mr. Waits, and he told her the same thing. She put her hands on her hip and said, "Won't you at least come look at him?" Well, being a pretty girl, they followed after. He said, "Lady, you're beautiful. What do you want for him?" She said, "Let's bargain." I didn't want to bargain with her. She made a deal. He would give us top market price. He would give us a container he wanted packaged in, and he would take everything we had, and we had a good deal going until he retired and sold the store, and we was tired anyway. We stopped for him. But you can take an old piece of ground, just work with nature, and you can bring it back to life. And you don't have time to grow cover crops like I did, or the machinery, but you can buy compost. There's a whole lot of people making compost and all kinds of good stuff to spray in your garden. Right now, Stuart will sell you a whole bunch of it, and Bob will tell you about the rest of it.
Well, the reason I chose these two people to start off is I knew that John would tell you a little bit about how to make that soil better today, how to have a much better soil next week. Malcolm's telling you how to do it if you have a little bit more time.
A bigger farm.
What's that?
A bigger farm.
And a bigger farm to work on. I want Stuart to pick it up right here for a second and talk a little bit about the microbial life that is so important in the soil, because this is what his business has always been built around.
That is hard to add to Malcolm Beck. How do you add to that? One of the things that I would recommend you look at when you're working with a soil is not to work the soil when it's too wet. Don't work the soil when it's too dry. The reason for that, if you're out there mudding around in the soil and digging holes, you lose your airspace, the soil dries out, it packs, it's harder, and it won't have the oxygen that it needs to support the biological activity. Same thing that happens if you work it too dry. I've seen some fields that farmers have a big tractor and they just like to plow, and there might be one weed out there, and they'll plow and plow and plow, and eventually when it does rain, the soil particles up on top are very fine, and it's like trying to pour water in a bucket of flour. It doesn't soak in, it doesn't go down into the dirt. So wait till, don't do something unless you have to. Be patient. Finally got some rain, take your time. Those are the conditions that help build microbial activity. We're working with some new additives now, some new products that can help take microbial activity to higher amounts. We're adding growing cultures in fermenters individually. These are all naturally occurring organisms that are chosen for their ability to be the most effective at mobilizing nutrients. And we work with some very large farmers, and the goal that they had was help us figure out the way to use the least amount of fertilizer or get the most out of the fertilizer that we use. And most people are not in the same condition that some of these big farmers are, but you want to get the most dollar for the amount of inputs, the most return for your inputs. And we're working with organisms that have that ability. We call this beneficial microbes. It's a dry form. Mix it with water. It's easy to use. Put it on soils that are loose, aerated, have other activities going. Some of these organisms are azotobacters, which take nitrogen from the air and form stable nitrogen in the soil. So I think we covered this question really good.
I think we are fine.
I want to add one thing.
Absolutely.
Just as a home gardener and not a chemist, black clay soil is the richest soil around. It's really good if you can get it into a state where it's alive and working. I lived for years in northwest Austin where the soil was a lot like this floor. You would hit it with a shovel and it would go boing. So when I moved east into black clay soil, it was a thrill. And the first thing I've always done is spray everything with Medina to try to bring it back to life and mulch like crazy. I am not a really big digger, and I don't have a, whatever that is, mountain man. So I just keep piling on layers and plant plants in your soil that have root structures that can go out and help you break up the soil.